How should our senators be appointed? Trudeau thinks it's a good idea to have no experience. I'm Marco Perri. Welcome to the Perri platform. I hope everyone enjoyed their holidays. It was nice and relaxing for me, and now I'm happy to be back and recording. The good thing is, we didn't really miss too much. The most headline-worthy news was that Donald Trump was cut out of Home Alone. Apparently it was a 7-second clip or something like that, so we're in good standing. Now, for some real news. The CBC put out an article today, quoting our outgoing Senate leader. What he talked about was essentially the way Trudeau goes about selecting and appointing who becomes a member of the Senate, and he contrasts that with Andrew Scheer's selection method. Here's the gist of it. They're both really stupid. But before we dive too deep into that, I think it's good to review what exactly the Senate is. They're a major part of our government, but they are seldom talked about. We have a House of Commons, a little bit more well known, and the Senate is their counterpart. As a matter of rank, the Senate is supposed to be above the House, but it does not necessarily mean that they have more power. For example, a Prime Minister just needs the confidence of the House. The Senate does not have to be swayed when it comes to being pleased. It doesn't matter if the Senate is upset with the Prime Minister. They can't issue a vote of no confidence, but the House can, and that makes sense because the House really is the elected officials, the people we voted for. In the Senate, they are appointed by the Prime Minister. So it would be weird to appoint people who don't like you in the first place. Now, the concept of the Senate is they serve as a sober second thought. That is, once the House passes a bill, people we voted for debate about it, they motion it, and if they pass it, the Senate gets to review it and see if it makes sense. If it does, they can give the go-ahead. If not, they have the power to send it back or reject it. They can try and propose revisions as well if they see a way to make it better. Now, some people have voiced displeasure with the Senate because they view it as a hindrance and added bureaucracy. There is some truth to that. It's an added layer of a mechanism that sort of slows down the process. The bills can't pass as swiftly as they should because the Senate has to review it, but there is a positive to that. You do get that second thought, that somber, sober thinking mechanism to make sure you're not passing something catastrophic. The way in which prime ministers appoint these senators has changed over the years though, based on reforms. Even the lengths of time that they can serve has come under scrutiny. It's bounced between unlimited, before, which I think was pretty crazy, to a proposed 8-year maximum now, and there are age restrictions such as you have to retire at 75. Some people argue that having a lower limit, in terms of how long you can serve for, allows the Prime Minister to shuffle the Senate every election, which introduces more partisanship into the equation. You can stack the Senate with people who you like, people who think like you, and once you do that, you take over the board. Others argue, though, that having it too long, that is the term a senator can serve, makes these senators complacent and out of touch with reality. Let's say you got into the Senate when you were 30, and now you've served for 40 years. The world has changed rapidly around you, but maybe you have not adapted, and you being a senator isn't doing much for Canada in today's current age. It's possible. That's why I like the idea of having a limit on the amount of years that you can serve for. Prior to that, it really was the president or the prime minister serving you a golden ticket. Here's a career for the rest of your life that pays well, has massive benefits, and you get status. You don't even have to be elected. Welcome to our government. That's not entirely without worry when it comes to my mind. It's pretty crazy because the Senate really is a controversial part of our Canadian government system. Not just the idea itself, but the length that you can serve for, even having it, and even how people are appointed into the Senate. All these things are debated very frequently, but little light is shed on it when it comes to the public's view. We don't really hear too much about the Senate drama, but trust me, it exists, and this has been a highly contentious topic for a long time. Maybe even since Canada formed, the Senate has been hotly contested. Now, I think that the Senate does serve a valuable purpose, but the way in which they are organized right now is far from perfect. Having a second, somber opinion that can supposedly bypass any party partisanship, I think it makes sense and it's a good thing. Making sure the House does not get carried away on the basis of emotion or not thinking clearly, these are all good things, but right now, I question if the Senate can even do that. And these discussions aren't even on the radar of the public. It's just not something we talk about. And I can bring in the previous example as well. Having someone who's lived in the Senate bubble for too long may not be able to have these rational ideas when it comes to dissecting a bill. Having someone there who's only been there for a short period of time may also suffer from that negative consequence. And here's where we get to today. Today's article. The outgoing Senate leader wants Trudeau to appoint more people with actual political experience into the Senate. So Senator Peter Harder is the person who said this, and he is the outgoing Senate leader. Quite the distinguished person. His main issue lies in this next fact here. Only a few of the recent Senate appointments had a background in politics. According to the CBC, most of Trudeau's 51 appointees to date have been political neophytes. In other words, that they've been noobs. They've been people with no experience in this world. It brings into question the hiring criteria. You would assume that political considerations would be very important, but seemingly they are not. The leader of the Senate is actually calling for more credence to be put on these criteria. But Trudeau seems to have another idea in mind. He's not basing his appointees on qualifications in the political world. What's he doing it based on then? Is it friendship? Is it owing people back? Is it something along the lines of gender and race and status when it comes to sexuality? Is it trying to make the board representative of Canada? Some of these are more noble than others, but that is the question though. If you remove the one salient variable, experience, from the equation, what are you hiring based on? I do wonder. If we really are concerned with fairness and getting the best candidates possible, it seems like a meritocracy is one of the better ways to go about it. But there is a dual consideration. It's a meritocracy combined with having someone who is not entirely partisan. You don't want somebody in the Senate who is only going to be arguing on behalf of their party. It's a bad idea, and that's where Trudeau has been thinking, and it led him to this conclusion. Let's just appoint people with no experience, and so therefore they will have no political ties. They're not from this world, they won't know anybody or anything, and they'll be free agents. This strikes me as foolishness though, that can only bog down the system. Trudeau did pass some good reforms in his time, like the creation of an independent board to help him select eligible candidates, but how is tenure? How is something like political capability not a commonly desired trait? That's the universal that seems to make things fair. If you want to hire someone fairly, experience is the way to go, but they are electing for a more obscure measure that we're not even too sure about. That's what happens when you take away the criteria. If we're not hiring someone with the credentials for the job, what new credentials are you using to make your decision? One rationale for this move that Trudeau has said is that he is trying to curb partisanship, and that's pretty obvious to me. The thing that may not be so obvious though is that this move comes with a price, and the price we haven't fully measured yet. Making sure that you eliminate partisanship to the maximum by hiring people who have no experience, who have no idea what politics is, that comes with a cost to Canada and our system. You can't have bias if you don't know the game, is the way he's thinking right now. And here's Trudeau's quote on the subject. I personally believe that having political experience ought not exclude you from consideration for the upper chamber. That is the Senate. We'd benefit from having individuals who have had experience in legislature or the House of Commons or who are most active in political life. But here's the key part. When you come to the Senate, you turn that page on party politics, and that's where he goes down his train of thought and arrives at the point that, okay, well, it would be beneficial to have people with experience, but it comes with baggage. They come from a world where they have to pick a side, and we don't want that in the Senate. There is some validity to that claim, but it's just not high resolution thinking. He's not seeing the big picture. Of course, you don't want a Senate to just ride along with whatever the Prime Minister orders, but this debases any sort of fair hiring criteria. If you are not looking for experience, which is an indicator of ability to perform job function, what do you turn towards? You go deeper down the slope of bias yourself. At some point in time, he even acknowledges the benefits of having these experienced people. He's openly saying it, but at the same time, he wants to deny that. The fact of the matter is you can have experienced people and still limit partisanship to a reasonable degree. This is not entirely mutually exclusive, but he's acting like it is. It's not wholly representative of the reality right now. I'm not even convinced of the fact that hiring inexperienced people removes bias to the degree that he seems to believe. These people are not foolishly ignorant about politics, I would assume. Even if they're coming from a world outside of politics, I'm sure they have their views on topics. They do come with some degree of partisanship. Right now it's under a veil though. If they're not coming, they're not open about what they're actually voting based on, it's just a mystery to us, and we have to figure it out. At least the one thing you can say about someone coming from a party is you kind of know how they're going to vote. You kind of know what they're going to vote against, but having random people with shrouded motives who have no history in politics doesn't seem like the best thing to me, especially when you consider how crucial this job is, and to have somebody with no idea of the political sphere, of the realm of politics, how do you suggest that that is a productive thing to be doing? There's also a case to be made that if somebody is now well versed in the world of politics, I'd wager that they would likely just go with the flow until they get their bearings. What legs do you have to stand on when you are completely unfamiliar with how the system operates? You might actually be more biased than someone who is familiar, than with somebody who understands what they have to do, what they stand for, and where they can object. Senator Harder adds to this by saying that there is a steep learning curve for some of Trudeau's appointees, and he would know he is the leader. They come from non-political fields, and it's a big transition. Obviously, like duh. These guys are coming from a range of different areas where things from the stakeholders to the job function, they're so widely different. He even alludes to novices being tempted to make a name for themselves by doing things like looking to strike down bills or amend things more readily. It's an effort to remove that novice tag from themselves by showing initiative, so they may be acting more spontaneously than required. He says it would be helpful in the mix of skill sets that are in the chamber to have people who've gone through the practicalities of legislating, which by definition requires compromise, and I agree with that. Trudeau's selection mechanism is faulty. Now, that does not mean that a faulty practice can't have some positive effects though. Harder states that the Senate has been more ready to challenge the Liberal government's proposals. Of 88 government bills, the Senate amended 32. So, partisanship does seem to have been curbed, but I wonder at what price though, and if a better equilibrium is possible. I do feel like it's true that we can achieve a better leveling of these variables. It also begs the question, do we want unelected? Because keep in mind, the Senate, these are not people we vote for. They are appointed. And also, inexperienced people toying with bills that are passed by politicians who we did elect. This is where people begin to suggest removing this branch entirely, the Senate, which right now I'm not entirely in favor of, but I can see where the argument is coming from. The opposite of Trudeau's ideals is Andrew Scheer and the Conservatives, which I think is equally foolish though. They bring to the table a proposal that is entirely backwards. So, Scheer promised during his election campaign to dismantle the Liberals' appointment process. He wanted it to go back to the days where leaders appointed loyal party members as a reward to the Senate. Because keep in mind, having a Senate position is extremely lucrative. It's an amazing job. You get paid extremely well. You can expense a lot of things, and there's so many benefits. So anybody would want that. This is full-on partisanship, though, is what he is advocating for. Simply giving people who are on your party and extremely loyal that Senate seat. You get the experience, but you get full-on partisanship too. This is arguably worse than the Liberal idea. The original conception of the Senate was a sober second thought, and it does become a political agenda-based revision with these changes. In Scheer's proposal, the Conservative proposal, loyal party members are the people they want to put in. I want people loyal to Canada and its citizens, not to an ideological party. Filling the Senate with people that obviously hold agendas does not seem productive to me. It opens the door to two immediate side effects. Number one is the Prime Minister gets even more power. A majority in the House of Commons likely cannot ever be stopped even by the Senate now. And number two, it enables revenge politics where die-hard party supporters get a second life in the Senate. As a die-hard party supporter, you may have voted against everything the opposing parties presented to you in the House, and now you can continue to do that in the Senate. Anything that comes from the opposing party automatically vetoed from you. These two guys, Scheer and Trudeau, they simply appear to represent two opposing ideas and two opposing sides that are simply just madness. Let's appoint noobs who know little about the system. That's in an effort to curb partisanship. Then you have Scheer. No, let's appoint loyal party members who will surely be biased, and that's for the experience side of things. It's polarization at its finest. I know that's the trend these days, but a middle ground still exists. We should be striving towards that. How about, this might sound crazy, but let's try to select for people unlikely to be heavily biased, but still requires some level of experience. This is so simple to me, but these guys can't seem to get it. We have no shortage of high-ranking public officials, independents, and even party politicians who show that they can think independently. It's a false dichotomy that Scheer and Trudeau presented of bad ideas. We have choices outside of these two suggestions now. If Trudeau gets to serve his full 4-year term, more senators will be up for replacement throughout. There are 105 seats and Trudeau will have appointed nearly 3/4 of them by the end of that term. I can only hope that he takes the advice of the outgoing Senate leader, because having nearly 3/4 of the Senate filled with random people who have no experience doesn't make sense to me, and it sounds like a terrible proposition. On the flip side, having nearly 3/4 filled with partisanship doesn't sound good either. If we cannot find a logical middle ground, I can envision the argument of simply just doing away with the Senate gaining traction. People don't want to be fed these idiotic ideas any longer, and they may just say scrap the entire thing. These two polar extremes don't make sense, and if you can't get to the middle, forget about it, because there is actually a lot of harm that can be done by messing with the Senate. A lot of stagnation can occur, and simply not understanding the practices or being too partisan are factors that can complicate and even speed that process up. Hopefully they get their things together, and Trudeau really has to think about his hiring policies in this case. Now, that brings me to the end of today's conversation. If you enjoyed the content, be sure to leave a review and share. That'll help us grow. You can also find me on Twitter and Instagram at Perri Platform. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you soon.